Hello to everybody. Delighted to see people from all over the place. It's lovely to be here in the hot seat rather than listening for a change, which is lovely. So just by a quick introduction, I live near Cambridge, but I'm originally from Scotland. I see some people here from Scotland, and I suppose I've been in the leadership space for over 20 years now. And ultimately, most recently, so pertinent to our discussions today, I have specialized my interest in sort of study and practice and development in collaborative leadership. And I can go into a bit of further details later about why that is. Which I find fascinating. So thank you for granting me the pleasure of interacting with you, Damien, and hearing other people's comments in the chat on the topic. And the red thread really that's gone through my career has been working with people and people development, but also in business development and partnership development. So I've had a career in leadership myself, but it's usually been in the development space. And then sort of I got interested in coaching around about early 2000s and have been sort of training in that area since, but also focusing on leadership development for global leaders around the world, designing programs, and then in the last sort of 10 years more really delivering programs. And a lot of my career has been at the University of Cambridge, at the Business School and another institute in Cambridge, but also most recently with a not-for-profit called the Whitehall and Industry Group, who specialise in collaborative leadership.
Mm,
So that's just a
great.
brief one.
Thank, thank you. And I was keen to have this conversation with you because obviously challenges that my clients are facing, obviously the complexity and the context everyone is finding themselves in. Um, so especially with advancements in technology as well and what this means for leaders. So why don't we start with um, perhaps asking you to define what you mean by collaborative
Hmm.
leadership.
Yes, and there's so many things you can say, but there are some quite nice definitions out there. I mean, I quite like the quote just to start with, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together, which is an African quote, which I just love, which kind of sums up some of the challenges and also reasons for, collaboration. But I would say that, collaborative leadership, because that's what we're specifically talking about, is, a really high level relational skill, which requires really sophisticated levels of emotional and social intelligence, and a very highly developed sense of self and a very highly developed sense of others as well. So that's why, in a sense, it's so relevant to the coaching space. In terms of the skills required to be a collaborative leader, and also the ability to use coaching to help develop collaborative leadership in leaders that we work with. So
Mm.
that's just as a starter. I don't know if that's enough for an
Yeah,
opening.
yeah, thank you. Well, and also, I mean, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, but just yeah, the I suppose the potential for coaching to be a mechanism to develop a leaders collaborative leadership as well
Yes.
from that definition. So you sort of mentioned the, I suppose the research base and your interest. So um, how about you just say a little bit more in terms of your journey around collaborative leadership, Kathy? Because that'd be interesting to.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I suppose, I've always been interested in the more human side of leadership development. So, it's quite easy to understand how going along the years and the way things have progressed in the sort of leadership space that I would end up being, particularly specializing and interested in collaborative leadership. And it is also we can't sort of talk about it without divorcing it from the kind of environment in which we're working, which, we've gone from sort of VUCA world to an even more chaotic and incomprehensible world, actually. And this kind of uncertainty that is, around for everybody, and as you said, the velocity of change that everybody has to experience, leaders and all alike. There's this real kind of imperative for people to be able to take a more collaborative approach to leadership in everything they do, and yet it's become harder to collaborate. So I think that's why there's such a need for development in the area, because there's quite a lot of myths around collaboration as well. It's not easy. It's actually really, really difficult, but it's so imperative. And that's largely against the backdrop of, the sort of poly crisis, if people, probably are aware of that term, or what people even call meta crisis, a sort of crisis of meaning and the way our worldview of what's going on. So there's this sense that we have to, there's a bigger kind of game in collaborative leadership now, which is going beyond the need to work collaboratively, I guess, in the organization, to get great results from working in teams with people, etc., to a sort of a larger purpose, I suppose, a bigger purpose. So I do see it as connected to the need for purposeful leadership, and particularly across sectors. So I do a lot of cross-sector work. So the need for the sectors to work together is, evident to solve some of those problems that we're facing in society. So there is a great move, and it is very much of its moment to be talking about, the ideas of collective intelligence, collaboration in order to solve some of those wicked problems. And so my sense is that it's easy to talk about that, but it's much harder to do it. So I'm on a bit of a passionate thing about trying to, in my own small way, and working with others, creating programs and creating sort of interest in collaborative leadership to actually try and move towards helping people to become more collaborative in their leadership work. And it's about leadership, and it's less of the leader and it's more of the leadership. So there's this idea that the ego gets a bit quiet because, the whole thing about collaboration is that you're going to have these advanced relational skills and emotional intelligence to be able to do all the things you have to do as a collaborative leader.
Mm. Yeah, and I've just seen a question pop up from David around what you think gets in the way. But as I listen to you talk and just reflecting on our current context, and I suppose I was just reflecting on where are the model, the leadership role models around collaborative leadership.
Yes.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you've got any
Well, I mean,
reflections on that before I
there's
ask you
some very
about what
interesting,
gets in the
yeah,
way.
there's interesting research on, there's loads of interesting projects that have gone on in the cross-sector space. And often this happens in crises, as we know, collaborative leadership in a crisis. Of course, the most common cited example is COVID. So, people did have to have, they were really at the sharp end then. So there's good examples of collaborations and collaborative work that have gone on, and also leaders themselves. There were, some of the leaders on the stage basically during the COVID period were interesting as well. Some of the political leaders who weren't collaborative and the ones who were collaborative. So there's quite a lot of sort of examples, and yet we're still facing a time of massive kind of polarization. And actually, you could really argue that COVID made things worse in terms of kind of individualism, if you like, because we had, people did become quite individualistic in the lockdown situation and so on. And the other thing to bring into this is that you can't really talk about collaboration without some of the themes of that, which I would see as things like trust, culture, and power. They all come into, talking about collaborative leadership. So there are some great examples. But there's still a lot to be done. As we know, some of the actors now on the world stage are the most individualistic leaders that that we can see.
What else would you say, just from your experience, is picking up on David's question, what is getting in the way for this to be, I
Well,
suppose, more of a focus for a
there's
lot of people?
I've an interesting, and I can give some, sort of references later to interesting thinkers in the collaborative leadership space. But there's one in particular that I find useful is Adam Kahane, who is a Canadian actually, who talks a lot about what he calls stretch collaboration. So that the point is that it's not easy to collaborate, and there's always this kind of tension in collaboration that we want to work, to collaborate, we have to work together, but we also actually have to give something up. We usually have to make some kind of compromise when we collaborate. So if you think about collaborators in World War II, whatever, those people who are collaborating with the enemy, as it were. So there's a double sort of edged sort of meaning if you think about the word collaboration, to work together. So we usually have to compromise on something and give something up because we're not all going to agree. And that's Kahane's point, is that we actually have to embrace conflict in order to get to a deeper results. So that's one thing that can stop collaboration, because people have to give the compromise, and it's not our human nature always to want to do that. So I think that's just one answer I would cite as an interesting one for that.
Thank you. Again, I was going to bring in Becky's question now, but just it's sort of linking. Do you feel there is a prevailing force on a hero model of leadership which works against
Yes.
collaboration?
Yes, yes. So, I mean, there's much talk about heroic, the need for a move from heroic leadership, which is very much a thing we would have hoped for sort of the last century, 20th century, but it's still with us here. And so there is massively, and there are so many. The other thing about collaboration and collaborative leadership, so many other areas of leadership come into it. So in systems thinking terms, the idea that the system is very important in terms of being able to collaborate or not. And of course, most of our systems are still very hierarchical. So they kind of embrace the heroic leader model, which is probably what we want to move away from. So often collaborative leadership's involved with more distributed leadership, the fact that everybody can be a leader. It's not about confusion between authority and leadership. You can be an authority and you cannot be a leader, I would argue. So there's confusion amongst that in terms of power plays and so on. So there definitely are still models everywhere abounding in organizations where they're hierarchical, which is very much rather an anachronistic sort of model for these days. But there's also those heroic leader figures, as we know, playing out on the world stage. So I would argue there's a need for a move from that, because it's just not sustainable in terms of what we have to achieve for society as a whole.
And and hearing you talk about, I suppose, different aspects of collaborating and collaborative leadership, I suppose connection I was making around all the work around psychological safety in
Yes,
organizations as
yes,
well, for people
yeah,
to be able to collaborate well and for leaders to have more of a collaborative style.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why culture comes into it a lot. So it's our job and responsibility as leaders, at all different levels and different parts of the organization and in different sectors, to take a look at the systems that we're working, to think, can we actually do something to change, some of the structures or the culture? Because there's definitely a job to be done when you are bringing about change in organizations, as we all know, in terms of culture, and notoriously difficult to bring about culture change. But that's again why, as if you are serious about wanting to make changes in the organizations that we work in, you have to sort of deploy quite high level leadership sort of capabilities. So that's why there's still the need for so much more in the development area.
Mm. Um, so I'm seeing another question coming from David. It sort of takes us towards another question I want to ask
Yes.
you. So he said, can you assess level of readiness for collaboration in an organization?
Well, I'm sure that some consultancies will have tried to have done that, and actually, funny enough, because I developed an open enrollment program on advanced collaborative leadership, for the Right to Whole and Industry Group, and in that program we have based projects for the leaders, and some of the leaders have got together to try and do something like that. So it definitely is a kind of topical area. How can we assess readiness? So I think we can be creative and think of ways that we could do that, and I think it would be very interesting to do so.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So another question is coming from Ruth, which is quite interesting. I just want to pick as much as I can, Kathy, while you're
Yeah,
here.
sure,
So,
no.
what are your thoughts on um, over collaboration and leadership,
Mm.
where decision making is then potentially slowed down too much? I
Yes,
suppose that's when the sort
yes.
of democratic sort of style goes into overplay.
Yes, definitely. I mean, again, there's an interesting model that Adam Kahane has in his work about, it's not always the case that we have to collaborate. There are times when we exit or we compromise, etc., etc. And also, obviously, the time lag, the fact that it takes longer sometimes, often, some may say, when we do have to collaborate, and especially in big collaborative partnerships and projects. You're absolutely right. It can be slower, but as I was saying with that proverb at the beginning, sometimes we have to go a bit slower to get further. And there's again, it may be a compromise that we have to make. There are times when we need to act very, very quickly, and there may be ways that within collaborations we can also, create the conditions to be able to do that. But I totally agree that, some collaborations can add time to, projects and results.
Mm. So, I mean, my knowing the group that will be here as well, a lot of them are going to be coaches as well as perhaps OD practitioners, etc. But
Yes.
from a coaching perspective, Cathy,
Mm.
just based on your experience, because I imagine there's something about the leaders' values that are going to be supporting whether
Yes.
they can use a collaborative sort of leadership style. Just in terms of your experience, how can you start to develop this with the
Yes.
leader?
Well, I mean, it's a good point. You're making an interesting point. And also, always the question, how much do you want to bring the collaborative leadership sort of thinking into the room? It's like as I know that you agree with, it can be on a case by case basis and what the needs of the coachee are, etc. But I mean, when you look at collaborative leadership, there are so many areas, like emotional intelligence, like the need to understand more about neuroscience, absolutely fundamental, because you've got to develop that sense of self and others. And I would argue that without any understanding of neuroscience, you can't really understand what is going on. And so using all the models and frameworks that perhaps you bring in with your coaching, many of them are relevant. So neuroscience is one, but also systems thinking is massively important, to thinking about all sorts of areas of systems thinking and systems leadership, like holistic and emergent properties and all these other bits and pieces. So there's you can always bring in frameworks and tools that are so relevant for collaborative leadership, and so I think it's easy to understand that. But then the other sort of thing I'm thinking from your question is, and it depends on your style of coaching, I guess, is how far you delve into sort of values and people's greater purpose in life, and more of the transpersonal sort of style of things, and what do we do about the world in general. And so that's also another element that would come out of such a conversation.
Yeah, which as you reflect that back for me, sort of feels vital for the leader to be able to hold, I suppose uh, this intent with authority, especially if the culture of the organization is very fast paced and short term, uh,
Yes.
because it will be challenging for the people that they're leading, perhaps to be held in that space for
Yes,
collective intelligence to be able to be released,
exactly.
Mhm.
Yes, it does very much depend on the organizational setting. Obviously, some people may not be working in cultures where collaborative leadership is encouraged or rewarded. That's the other thing, but what about the rewards for collaboration? You might have a greater purpose, but it might not be the rewards that your organization is looking for. Now, I do a lot of work in the public sector just now, probably because I have just come from the Whitehall Industry Group, who do a lot of work with the civil service and other public sector, where it's easier with the purpose sort of being far more prominent. The private sector, it may be harder, but I'm very interested in opening that dialogue much more with the private sector, and again, very much interested in the cross-sectoral, piece as well. And also, of course, people transition a lot in their careers, so that's another thing about coaching. Obviously, you're coaching a lot at transition moments, and people may well be transitioning to different sectors with very different cultures.
Mm. Well, I imagine a lot of the skills that we have as coaches are the skills that a collaborative leadership would be demonstrating
Absolutely.
in their engagement, their
Absolutely.
ability, yeah, ability to hold dialogue, listen, etc.
Definitely. And there's again one of the McDermott and Hall who've written a book on collaboration. They're quite influenced by, NLP areas, but they have a sort of a whole load of states of collaboration that are really useful for, in order to get into that mindset to be in the right place to be collaborative. And they're really very resonant with the sort of the uh, the areas that you at Catalyst Month also focus on a lot in your coach training, like presence, like openness, like abundance, like all those areas that absolutely you have to have in order to have this collaborative focus in your leadership.
Mm, thank you. Thank you. So I'm just going to put my glass on, so I want to read a question.
Yeah.
How can we reconcile the might is power sentiment that seems to be driving world leaders today,
Mm.
values of coaching at any level?
Yes, it's very difficult, and sometimes it really, and I think it puts we coaches and developers of people as much sometimes in what can only be described as despair as the people that we're working with, and we all know that we have to, we have these feelings, I think, or sometimes of, we lose hope and so on and so forth. I think it can be very difficult. However, you do still constantly sort of get a sense, I think, in some of the sort of some of the interesting sort of movements, shall we say, and think tanks that are working in the area of collective intelligence, and even things like, democracy and other areas which are, very much about collective and community, that you do also see some brilliant work going on. So I just think
Mm,
you just have to keep that sort of active hope, to coin a word of a famous book on the area. You've got to keep that active hope going in order to make some difference ourselves. So I think if we have to, and that's another thing that I'm very passionate about, helping coachees to get beyond any kind of despair that they might have, and overwhelm, which we know that we all face in the work that we do. And it is particularly difficult at the moment when, and as you alluded to at the beginning, the technological advances, there are the good points of AI and the also very questionable areas of AI that are making life, and potentially many areas of our human sort of elements extremely difficult going forwards.
mm, mm. Well, and also just I suppose the value in vehicles like group coaching as a way of
Yes,
really bringing this to life in the room, really, rather than I
exactly.
suppose
I
developing
totally
leaders
agree
in
with
a
that.
vacuum.
Yes,
Mm,
and that's the beauty of collaborative work as well, because this greater than the sum of its parts element, which happens when you get a group of people together and you get them behind a vision to do something for the better good, is just so powerful. And
mm,
and we see, and you can see it and feel it, and it really just helps to make people grab onto the optimism that we need everybody to have.
mm. So, in terms of, I mean, you've mentioned a few references as we've been
Hmm.
talking, but I'm conscious we're sort of touching something that's a big topic in terms of the
Yes.
conversation. So, if there were areas you would point people to in terms of being good resources around
Hmm.
collaborative leadership, what comes to mind for you?
Well, I think the work of Adam Kahane, Kahane, the Canadian consultant he is, but he was actually back in the day working at Shell doing their futures thinking and scenario planning. But he's written some really interesting books on collaborative leadership. One is about power and love, which is really interesting. The other one is collaborating with the enemy, and this idea that we have to work with people that we don't like or trust in collaboration sometimes, and how to do that. So he's one that I would really recommend as being very interesting. And then there's also another couple of books I could recommend on the area. But I don't know whether I should do that in the chat or separately afterwards, do you think?
Well, I mean, if you're happy to mention them now, Kathy, while
Yeah,
we're
so there's Lubish and Brent, The Leader's Guide to Collaboration. Um, so those two, and then McDermott and Hall that I mentioned earlier, The Collaborative Leader. So those are quite recent books on the area. So those three, I think, Adam Kahane, McDermott and Hall, and Lubish and Brent. They're all quite different, but they're quite practical Adam
Mm.
Kahane's work is both conceptual and practical, and really very, very interesting to bring a different sort of viewpoints on collaborative work, also with lots of examples of work that has gone on, at a global scale in collaborative leadership.
Mm. Mm. Well, I know we've only got a couple of minutes, but I was really just interested with that reflection you just shared around that piece of, collaborating without necessarily the trust being there.
Yes.
So I just wondered if you could say a few more about that, because I imagine I would often see that a lack of trust would be a barrier to collaborating.
Yes. Well, I think trust is at the foundation, as we know, of relationship. So we can't have it. So that's leaders have to get better at building the trust and looking at what their trust propensities like. Do they trust enough? Do they trust too much? But also trustworthiness. So, that trust piece is like at the heart of everything, isn't it? So, but sometimes we may have to work with people that we might see as enemies, and that's Kahane's idea again about this idea of enemy-fying. We're very quick, and I know we talk a lot about judging people too quickly, etc. We're very quick to jump on judging people, and we have to learn how to challenge ourselves in that. So it's a
Mm.
really complex area, but it's one that's absolutely, fundamental, I think, to all things relational.